this lecture, we'll be discussing some problems for consequentialism and utilitarianism. First, I want you to think about two different cases where utilitarianism has differing judgments from what we might think of as our normal moral judgments. The case of the life-saving poisoner is a situation in which, suppose you dislike your boss. You dislike him so much that you plot to murder your boss. Your boss loves food, and you know this, so you buy your boss a decadent cheeseburger, and you attempt to poison it. When you go to poison it, you accidentally mix up the arsenic with the aspirin. You know, they're both labeled A, and they're near each other in your medicine cabinet. And by accident, you put aspirin in the cheeseburger that you serve to your boss. Now, unbeknownst to you, your boss is about to have a heart attack. Upon eating the cheeseburger, your boss has a heart attack, but the aspirin that's in the cheeseburger actually saves your boss's life. Now, your boss is a good member of society, and everyone loves your boss, and so ultimately, the fact now that you tried to poison your boss has led to his life being saved, and it's ultimately made everyone in the community much more happy. Now, according to utilitarianism, the consequences of your action in attempting to poison your boss were extremely good. They made everyone more happy on the whole, and so the action was morally right. Now take another case, similar setup. However, by accident, you actually end up poisoning your boss. Suppose you make the cheeseburger yourself and slightly undercook it, or serve slightly bad meat, and that causes your boss to die. You're trying to do something nice for your boss instead of bad for your boss in this case, and it accidentally causes your boss to die. In this case, that makes everyone sad, and you have done something morally wrong according to utilitarianism, even though you weren't attempting to do so. Now, in these two cases, there's at least two sort of general problems that seem to arise for utilitarianism. On the one hand, things that we normally think of as immoral, certain kinds of actions, are going to turn out to be moral just in case they happen to be involved in situations that ultimately lead to more happiness. Second, utilitarianism tells you that most of the time your actions are actually immoral and that you are actually a bad person on the whole when your actions don't lead to general overall happiness and good consequences. And you might think, well, wait a minute, that can't really be right. I mean, I'm a good person most of the time, right? I try to do good things. But on utilitarianism, whether or not you're trying to do good things is neither here nor there. In fact, it just doesn't matter. This might make utilitarianism seem like it's missing something, like there's some sort of moral consideration that utilitarianism on the whole just doesn't get at. And that seems right on the surface, right? It doesn't seem to give certain kinds of considerations to an attempt to try to do the right thing rather than, actually just doing the thing that happens to create the most happiness. Now, if that's right, and trying to do the right thing in some way matters morally, then ultimately it's going to seem like utilitarianism isn't a fully adequate moral theory. That is, it doesn't actually capture all of our intuitions about what's right and what's wrong, because it only focuses on the consequences and happiness. And maybe in the end, happiness isn't the only thing that matters. The initial question arises here about whether or not moral goodness is based only in the consequences of an action, and whether or not we can determine whether or not an action is good or bad, right or wrong, on the basis of understanding the intentions behind the action. Direct utilitarianism, in particular, seems to conflict with our general intuition that intentions matter for moral actions. In particular, direct utilitarianism seems to conflict with the needs of justice and ultimately can be used to condone the violation of basic human rights. Now, there are two cases that often get brought up to show this. The case of the hospital and the case of the angry mob. In the case of the hospital, imagine someone goes to the emergency room because they have, a bloody nose and their nose won't stop bleeding. Upon, getting to the emergency room, they're checked in, they get tested, and the emergency room doctor realizes that this person is a perfect match for 5 other individuals that are in the hospital that happen to have serious ailments with failing organs. Now, what should this doctor do? Normally, we would think, oh well, you patch the person up, you fix their bloody nose, and you send them on their way. But in this case, according to act utilitarian or direct utilitarian line, you might be able to promote the general happiness, maximize happiness by actually basically just taking this person, killing them, harvesting their organs, and using those organs to save the other 5 individuals, thereby, creating, saving 5, sacrificing 1, creating 5 times as much happiness in the world as there would have been. Now, that seems rather problematic. The idea, like, why would anybody ever go to a hospital in such a case? Well, you might change the case, too, to think of, like, the individual that's in the ER as someone with no family and no friends, that's kind of just a loner, and nobody would actually miss this person. Well, in this situation, would it be morally right, to actually kill this individual in order to save the other 5? That seems like a problem for direct utilitarianism because it seems like it's violating the individual person's rights in order to create happiness. Another case of interest here is the case of the angry mob. Suppose that there's some sort of riot forming in a small town, and in order to calm down the riot, the sheriff realizes that he can frame an innocent man. Now, the idea here would be to, framing the innocent man and thereby quelling the riot, given whatever the rioters are angry about, before the rioters, go out into the streets and harm other people and destroy a bunch of property, ultimately leading to a bunch of sadness, right? A bunch of unhappiness, a bunch of pain. Now, the utilitarian calculus here says, well, look, you can sacrifice one person's life and thereby save a bunch of property damage and probably the lives of a bunch of other people. So it seems like, what should be done in this case? Well, the sheriff should sacrifice one individual and thereby quell the riot. But this seems quite problematic, right? As, again, it seems to conflict with our notion of human rights, and this person is innocent, right? So they shouldn't be blamed for something that they haven't done, whether or not that's going to ultimately lead to, more happiness and less unhappiness on the whole. Direct or act utilitarianism, it seems, then conflicts with the dictates of justice. The view tells us to sacrifice an individual's rights whenever doing so would bring about more happiness for more people. But could this really be right? Could morality, or the correct moral theory, really require of us to kill, maim, harm, or injure anyone in order to bring about the pleasure of others? Maybe. I mean, if you think about cases like war, a justified war, where human life is ultimately on the line in order to bring about justice or peace, maybe utilitarianism ultimately can justify these things. But in these particular cases, it seems at least problematic. Another interesting problem or puzzle for direct utilitarianism is highlighted by the case of the trolley problem. The trolley problem is an example in which a runaway trolley is hurtling down the tracks towards 5 individuals. For some reason, there are 5 people on these tracks, and they're stuck or they can't get off. Who knows why? You happen to be standing near a lever, and you realize that if you were to pull the lever, it would divert the trolley away from hitting the 5. However, it would divert it to a different track where one person is somehow also stuck. In this case, the question then becomes, well, what should you do? Should you save 5 people, but then thereby doing something that leads to the death of one? Or should you do nothing at all? Would you pull the lever, saving the 5 and sacrificing the 1, or not? Normally, most people's initial response is that they think that they should pull the lever, sort of a gut reaction or moral intuition that saving 5 people and sacrificing one is, better than sacrificing one rather than letting 5 people die. However, the problem itself becomes more interesting when we change the example. Suppose instead of being near a lever, you're standing on a footbridge overlooking the trolley as it's hurtling by, and you're standing near a particularly large man. You realize that it's possible that that you were to push this large man off of the footbridge at the precise moment that he would land right in front of the trolley, thereby dislodging the trolley from the tracks, sending it falling off the side, thereby saving the 5 individuals that are stuck further down the tracks. And the question then becomes, would you push this large man? Most people's intuitions here seem to shift. Most people think, no, I would not push the large man, while I would pull the lever. Please, at this point, watch the trolley problem video that is posted on Canvas. Now, why is it that these two cases, the trolley problem, is a puzzle or issue for direct utilitarianism? Well, on the different situations, if the consequences are ultimately all that matters, then it looks like you should both pull the lever and push the large man. There's not going to be any morally relevant difference between the cases because the consequences are ultimately the same. In the one case, you save 5 and 1 person dies, and in the other case, you save 5 and 1 person dies. What could possibly be the difference in these cases, morally speaking, if the consequences are all that matters? You might at this point be suspicious of utilitarianism and want to reject it on the basis of thinking that there really has got to be some morally relevant difference between the two cases. But what could that morally relevant difference be? Can you think of anything? Some have been convinced that there's a difference, particularly moral difference, between what's called doing and allowing, causing harm and allowing harm to occur. Now imagine these two different situations. In one situation, both of which are terrible, right? In one situation, you see that someone is about to get hit by a bus, and you do nothing to get them out of the way. In another situation, you push someone in front of a bus. Now, in the thought, in both situations, the consequences are ultimately the same. The person gets hit by a bus. However, in the one situation, you allow the harm to occur, and in the other situation, you cause the harm, you do the thing. In particular, people tend to think that the doing is worse than the allowing. There's a general thought that being the central cause of certain harms is morally worse than allowing certain harms to occur. When one knows that a certain harm might occur and does not interfere, one may be doing something morally problematic. However, when one causes when one is central to the cause of the harm itself, it seems quite problematic. Here, this might explain the difference in intuitions that people have in the trolley problem cases. By pulling the lever, one merely allows harm to occur, when pushing the large man actually is involved in a doing. It's causing the harm. If this is true, though, And we hold fixed that the harm that occurs is the same in both cases. That is, one person dies and 5 people are saved. Then it's got to be the case that consequentialism, or at least utilitarianism of this sort, is false, because it seems like there's a moral difference, but the consequences of each situation are the same. There's a doctrine called the doctrine of double effect, which attempts to explain this sort of moral difference here and explain why intentions actually matter morally. And if intentions do matter, then for morality, then consequentialism has to be wrong, because something other than the consequences matter. Thereby, utilitarianism has to be wrong because something other than the consequences bringing about happiness matter. The two cases that are, or one case that's sort of interesting, the two different examples, is the case of the tactical bomber versus the case of the terrorist bomber. Imagine in a wartime situation, there's a munitions factory that is located close to an elementary school. Now, in the tactical bomber case, a person that wants to end the war sooner in order to bring about peace is going to bomb the munitions factory with the recognition that the children's school is nearby. However, if in blowing up the munitions factory they harm any children in the process, it wasn't their intention to harm the children, right? It was something that they foresaw as a possibility in blowing up the munitions factory, and in a situation in which it occurred, it was something that they didn't intend. However, they foresaw the possibility. In the other case, the terrorist bomber case, the terrorist actually intends for the school to be blown up and intends for as much harm and destruction to occur when blowing up the munitions factory. So here, the same example, the same consequences ultimately result. The bombs get dropped, the munitions factory explodes, the school becomes affected, some children end up dying. However, in the one case, the tactical case, the fact that the children die is unintended. It's an unintended consequence, even though it is a foreseen consequence. Whereas in the terrorist bomber case, the atrocity of harming these children is actually intended. It seems people tend to think that the terrorist bomber case is worse because of the intentions involved. If that's correct, then consequentialism must be wrong because intentions matter for morality. We need to be careful here, though, because things might not be so simple. Utilitarianism, as a view, can still respond to many of these criticisms, because there's another distinction that we need to sort of be careful in thinking about when we're talking about rightness and wrongness, and that's the distinction between being praiseworthy and blameworthy for your actions. It's possible that doing the right thing and doing the wrong thing could come apart from being praiseworthy and being blameworthy. It might be that if you do the right thing with the right intention, that you are ultimately praiseworthy in your action. However, it could be that you did the right thing in a certain situation, but with the wrong intention, right? So maybe you save your boss's life by giving him aspirin at the opportune moment. However, you were trying to murder your boss. In such a case, you may have done the right thing, morally speaking, but not be praiseworthy for what you did. In this case, the thought is we might use this kind of distinction to explain what's going on in these intuitively problematic cases for utilitarianism. Indirect utilitarianism avoids the problems that plague direct utilitarianism when it comes to the hospital example, the mob example, and maybe even the trolley problem example. The reason for this is that indirect utilitarianism says that we should follow particular rules that are dictated by the general principle of morality, the greatest happiness principle. And so in the hospital case, generally actions that tend to bring about the most happiness are to treat individuals that come into the ER, not sacrifice them in order to harvest their organs. Similarly, in the mob case, actions that tend to promote the most happiness are treating innocent people as innocent, right? Similarly, possibly in the case of the trolley problem, the action that tends to promote the most happiness is to avoid causing, to save people if possible, but to avoid, pushing people and causing people to fall to their death. However, indirect utilitarianism in general is still problematic because it's a species of consequentialism. A famous philosopher, Bernard Williams, has posed two cases, the case of the botanist and the case of the chemist, to show that even indirect utilitarianism is problematic because consequentialism itself is problematic. Williams' two famous cases. In the first one, we have the botanist. I'll call him Jim. Jim the botanist is, travailing the Amazon forest, looking for fancy plants, and he comes across a military group that has captured a number of native people, and the military group is going to murder these 20 natives by firing squad. And the leader of the military group comes to Jim and says, "Jim, here you go. I'm going to give you this gun, and I'm going to have you shoot one of these natives. If you shoot one of these natives, then the other 19, are free to go. However, if you don't shoot one of these natives, we're going to shoot all 20. Now, the question here becomes, a deep moral problem for Jim. Jim is, your regular botanist. He's not someone that's a cold-blooded killer. He's not someone that's maybe even thought a lot about whether or not he could kill someone in any situation. He doesn't want to have to kill anyone, particularly not in this kind of scenario. Now, but what is the right thing for Jim to do in this case? Supposing that Jim doesn't want to kill anyone, should Jim kill one person in order to save another 19? Or should he allow 20 people to die? That seems problematic. According to utilitarianism, the answer is obvious. Kill one person and save the 19. In the other scenario, the scenario of George the chemist, or the chemist, I'll call him George. George is in a tricky situation. He graduates from with his PhD and in chemistry, but he can't find a job. His family is sort of suffering because he doesn't have money, and he's offered a job by a colleague, but the job is working for a chemical weapons facility. Now, in George's sort of life goals, life plans, he wants to use his chemistry degree for good. He has a serious problem with the manufacture and use of chemical weapons. However, if he were to take the job, it would make his family happy. Now, his colleague also lets him know that were he not to take the job, then they would hire somebody else that's very gung-ho about chemical weapons. And so George has the opportunity to take a job with a company that he doesn't really like, but to slow down the pace of the research, thereby leading to less chemical weapons on the market, less people getting injured, and in wartime having chemical weapons used on them. So on the utilitarian calculus, it seems that George should take the job and work as slowly as possible so that less chemical weapons end up on the market and less people die and become horribly maimed by these chemicals. However, George doesn't want to have to work for this company. So the question then becomes, what should George do? Williams criticizes consequentialism in general because he thinks that the view ultimately disregards a person's integrity and their personal life plans. Consequentialism is callous, cold, and calculating in that it requires that we ignore our own projects, our own emotions, our own feelings, in order to bring about the happiness of others, of everyone, and avoiding the unhappiness of everyone. This, Williams thinks, is ultimately unrealistic for a moral theory. Here is a quote from Williams. "The point is that the agent is identified with his actions as flowing from projects or attitudes which he takes seriously at the deepest level, as what his life is about. It is absurd to demand of such a man, when the sums come in from the utility network, which the projects of others have in part determined, that he should just step aside from his own project and decision and acknowledge the decision which utilitarian calculation requires. It is to alienate him in a real sense from his actions, and the source of his action in his own convictions. It is to make him into a channel between the input of everyone's projects, including his own, and an output of optimific decision. But this is to neglect the extent to which his projects and his decisions have to be seen as the actions and decisions which flow from the projects and attitudes with which he is most closely identified. It is thus, in the most literal sense, an attack on his integrity." Williams thinks that an adequate moral theory ought to take into account the moral integrity that goes into being the origin of your own actions. That is, the center from which actions stem from your own ideas and projects. Consequentialism says that you ought to ultimately sacrifice your plans, no matter how well-intentioned or central or integral they are to your own personality or psychology or narrative, if they don't optimifically create the best situation for everyone. So ultimately, if Williams is right, then personal integrity matters morally. Consequentialism then turns us into what we might think of as morally calculating automata that don't, where our own personal plans and integrity just get factored in to the calculus that we run when trying to make decisions. That means ultimately, on his view, that consequentialism can't be an adequate moral theory because it doesn't take an individual's integrity centrally into account when thinking about what it is that individuals should do. Up to this point, we've seen problems with consequentialism for utilitarianism and also just general problems with act utilitarianism. However, there's specific problems that have to do with hedonism. Hedonism is the view that happiness ultimately boils down to pleasure, and so what makes something morally good is how pleasurable it is, and pleasure is ultimately the thing that we ought to be pursuing. There's this once you accept hedonism, you get this thing called the hedonic decision procedure, which is basically when you're trying to decide what to do, what's going to be morally the right thing to do, you should do whatever will bring about the most pleasure. However, there's a problem, and the problem is the experience machine. This machine was postulated by a philosopher by the name of Nozick, and the example goes like this. Imagine, if you will, there's a machine, sort of like The Matrix, if you've seen the Matrix movies, in which you could get into the machine, and once in it, you'd forget that you've gotten into it, and it would give you the most pleasurable experiences you could ever have in your life. It would, in a way, it would be like virtual reality, but in this virtual reality simulation, you would be experiencing all of the greatest things life has to offer. You would get all the best jobs, you would have all the power that you wanted, you would be recognized for all of your achievements, you would marry the most beautiful spouse, you would have the most wonderful children. All of those things would happen to you. You would experience a life of the most pleasure possible. Now the question is, given the possibility of this machine, suppose somebody showed you the machine and offered to let you get into the machine, the question then arises, should you get into the machine? Most people ultimately think, no, I don't want to get into this machine, no matter how much pleasure I'll ultimately experience from it. And Nozick thinks that this shows that there's something other than pleasure that people value. And if there's something other than pleasure that people value, then pure hedonism is wrong. And so some of the underlying features of utilitarianism are fundamentally problematic. One way of thinking about this is that ultimately something other than pleasure itself is valuable, something about authenticity, like authenticity with respect to living your life making sure that it's real and not some sort of simulation, and having genuine interactions with actual people in the world seems like the kind of thing that some people think is valuable. And if that sort of thing is valuable, then it's not the case that pleasure for pleasure's sake is the only thing that's valuable. Taking all of these criticisms for granted, utilitarianism is still an interesting moral view that has a lot of applications. Many contemporary utilitarians take what we might think of as a two-leveled approach to the theory, where there's some sort of fundamental base level theory that handles human rights and ultimately says that we're not allowed to violate those rights even in an attempt to make everyone happy. The utilitarian calculus then comes in on top of the basic theory of human rights and is used to deal with moral decision making about anything that doesn't have to do with conflicts in human rights. This kind of utilitarian thinking is pretty plausible and works, I would say, very well for lawmakers and governments. Governments should probably be acting in utilitarian ways where they don't violate individual human rights. Once rights have been taken into account, however, we should really be trying to make the most people the most happy without doing anything that would violate any of those rights.